what I'd like to do today, and I talked to Gloria about the timeline, because I would like to have an opportunity to answer some questions and make commitments on behalf of the federal government for funding for this area. Well, Senator Carstairs isn't here. I'm just joking. But I would like to actually share with you some of the directions that the province is going in this very important area, and then actually have a chance to have a bit of interaction with the audience, if that would be great. Now, first of all, I want to just tell you a little bit about myself, because the issues around end of life and palliative care have been something that I got some early experience with. I am a physician, and I'm trained as a hematologist. And so, just by definition, then a lot of the work that I did as a physician for many years was with people who had various forms of cancer or other very serious illnesses. And so early on in my professional life, I had a real sense of people dying, and that actually death wasn't a particularly scary thing, but that as a society we were generally pretty uncomfortable with it. I also lost a brother just as I was graduating from medical school, and he was cared for both for his surgical diagnosis and then for palliative care by Dr. Balfour Mount at the Royal Victoria Hospital. And I think many of you probably have heard of Balfour. And so I was in my mid-20s at that time, and it was a very powerful experience to actually go through that time with my brother, who was just 29, and to meet Balfour and to follow his career for many years after. And then as I moved into other parts of my medical life, I spent a lot of time working with women with medical problems and blood problems in pregnancy. And those people get into difficulty, not themselves. You lose very few, fortunately, young women in pregnancy, but they often had babies that were born very early or with some very serious problems. And so I learned about families coping with end of life at the very beginning of life. And that's a very powerful and really an extraordinary experience to have, and one where I think if there's a dark cupboard in the end of life community, that's one of them, where I think people who have experienced losing a newborn baby realize that nobody knows how to talk about that at all. And their only solution is, well, have another pregnancy. And so that was I was very fortunate, I think, to actually be able to experience, a sort of slowly growing movement led by people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who were some of our early heroes in this area. But at a personal level, to be able to see just what a struggle it was for us to actually get our heads around dying at whatever age. And much more recently, in fact, on the 1st of May, I lost my mother at the age of 87. And she was a very interesting person, very, very robust. On the front page of our pamphlet, we had a picture of her driving a 4x4, not a motorcycle, but a four-wheeled motorcycle, basically last summer. So this was an 87-year-old that really loved life, and there was no holds barred for her, and she had her plans, and she actually had a relapse of a cancer and died quite quickly. But she died at home in the country in Quebec with a palliative care team and our family with her. And that was a very powerful experience, because just what Senator Carstairs said, she knew what she wanted, and we had to figure out what she wanted, and it was our job as a family with the care providers to make that happen. And what you learn is that's not easy. That even when you have the best intentions of a system that's trying to provide that kind of responsiveness, there's still that medicalization, and there's still that dynamic of we're in charge and you're dying. And so I just want to tell you that I want to put in a plug for not only the healthcare system, and I'm going to talk to you about that, what we're doing in this province and how that relates to what Senator Carstairs has said. But you have to understand that our families and our communities and our spiritual community, all of us have to fight for, the balance of power at the end of life. Because even though we want our healthcare system to support us, we don't want them to take it over. You don't want to see end of life, even at home, medicalized, where everyone on the team is in charge, and once again, the power imbalance that's pretty typical of our healthcare systems and our providers in our healthcare system, who are very wonderful people, but it's hard for them always to allow people to be in charge for themselves. So I want to put in a plug for that from a very personal perspective. That's not government policy, but as a physician and an individual who's gone through it with 2 parents and a brother, I can tell you it's really important for us to teach our public about it, to have them understand that it's okay for them to make with their family member who's dying different kinds of decisions, and to support that. Because we are all dying, and so at the end of the day, like, who cares who makes the decision? So our job as a system is to support those decisions and to work around them, and not to have too many rules, you know, to actually control that. Now, I know that we're very lucky in this province. We have some very, very wonderful leaders in the area of end of life and palliative care. And I know that some of you are wondering, well, where is the government on this? And so what I'm going to talk to you is a little bit about how we're approaching this, and to give you a real sense. I hope that there is something there are lots of very powerful things happening. You know that 4 years ago, we restructured our healthcare system and created our health authorities, which were sort of the next step on a track that we've been on for over a decade in this province. And we created 5 what I call geographic health authorities, and then we have a provincial health authority that has sort of responsibilities that cut across all the geographic ones. But it's the geographic ones that I really want to focus on today, because their job is to look after their public. And their advantage is that they have the responsibility for a whole continuum of services. And those go from public health and prevention through primary care, through all the community programs that support people in and around primary care, through acute care and hospitals, which many of our public still believe that's the center of the universe in terms of healthcare. And then back out of hospitals and around community programs, and then into the residential care sector. And I think what you know is that we have really tried to move quickly to actually develop an understanding of that continuum and how powerful it can be if you use it properly, to actually create opportunities to provide a wide array of services for the public. And that the thing that we need to focus on is how do we do that in a way that actually gets us the best value for what is an enormous investment in healthcare. And so end-of-life care is a part of that. And we have been working with the health authorities. We've developed a framework that has not yet been made public, but many of you, I think, have seen our discussion paper. And that was done through quite a robust processes with a lot of stakeholder involvement. Lots of our local experts feed in from the international and the rest of the Canadian community. And I think it was a very robust paper that outlined all the things that we have to do. And out of that, we actually do have a framework document, and my hope is that we will see that coming out in the very near future once we have a new cabinet named, and we've had a little bit of time for a new minister to get settled and be properly briefed. We have, with the health authorities, made it very clear in the direction we've given to them this year in their performance agreement that here's the draft framework. We don't anticipate it's going to change a whole lot. It has all of the fundamental elements that you would want to see in there, and we've given them direction that they should proceed and continue on with building their end-of-life capacity in a way that speaks to the best practice that I think you're all very familiar with. So that we're very committed and acknowledging that end-of-life care, just as you've heard today, has to foster people's ability to die at home, and the services that allow that to happen, regardless of whether you're in a big urban community or in a rural community, have to be appropriately aligned. We need to recognize that there are times when people are going to be in hospital and need to be in hospital, and we need to have robust services there that actually have the expertise to deal with their needs, and I think we know we have a long way to go. We are very supportive of the hospice movement, and currently we have a number of things. We've actually more than doubled our hospice beds in the province, and that's still a little bit of a hiccup. I mean, there were 57 when we started in 2001, and we now have about 107 that are existing, and a plan for another 60 to 70 to be brought on stream in the next couple of years. So we're slowly but surely working with independent hospice societies to actually build the hospice movement and align it with our healthcare system. Because that's what's important. There has to be the connections and the interfaces and the proper support, because it's difficult to operate those kinds of facilities in isolation. We have a new act that you may be familiar with, which is the act that actually governs the community care sector. And Minister Whitred brought it in, and it was a revision of our old Community Care Act, and it's now called the Community Care and Assisted Living Act. And at the time, because that was very early on in her tenure, we weren't ready to build the hospice movement specifically into that act. But as you know, we are out consulting about the regulation that goes with that, and we have asked Andy Hazelwood's shop, who's my ADM responsible for that area, to actually consult about what specific, unique issues we need to address in those regulations that relate to supporting a hospice movement in this province. I think you know that the issues around home care are very, very important, and what we're trying to do is build on the various platforms that we have. So we have the nurse line, and at this point, we see the nurse line as a platform for the whole province. It has a huge capacity to help both our providers, our institutions, and our public. People like the nurse line. The use of the nurse line is going up like this, and the vast majority of users are seniors. So they know 24/7 they can call that line. They'll get a nurse who's very knowledgeable, and at times they can get action to a pharmacist, and we have an experiment going with the Fraser Health Authority where we can actually move them through the nurse line, and if we feel they need a physician around end-of-life issues, they will be put through to physicians. So what we're trying to do is build the capacity of important platforms that we've established and enhance their ability to deal with specific areas, in this case, end of life. We're very cognizant of the need for more research and more benchmarks and indicators of how are we doing. I mean, right now, the most important marker that we have is how many people are dying in the hospital. So right now in British Columbia in 2004, 54% of people who die are dying in hospital. Now that's going to be inevitable. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where people don't die in hospital, but what we know is we can make significant progress on that if we can establish robust systems and end-of-life supports for people at home, in hospices, and in our complex care facilities where a lot of our public do die. And they, as I think Senator Carstairs says, I mean, they may be in that end-of-life track for 2 or 3 years. And so a lot of our work has to also be focused on what's their experience in that, and how does that relate to our end-of-life framework, and how can we use those facilities for respite care for people who are dying at home, but at a certain point it gets tiring sometimes for families. It's a huge burden on families, especially in a big country like this, when, as in my family, I was commuting from British Columbia. I had a brother commuting from Toronto, and even my 2 sisters in Montreal, and you can see we're a big family, and that helps. They were commuting from Montreal, a 2-hour drive out into the eastern townships. So it's hard. And, my mom died quickly, but if she'd gone on for 6 months, we would have had to have some kind of help and a break, in an environment where you couldn't support her 24/7 in her house. It was, too rural and too distant. So we've got to get creative, and we've got to break down some of those silos that says, oh, well, you can't use residential care for, this and that. I wasn't designed for that. And we see our health authorities actually really moving out and starting to see opportunities and trying to be flexible. And frankly, often when they're flexible, we're the ones that create barriers in the government because we say, oh, our regulations don't allow that. And so keeping ahead of innovation and flexibility and a diversity of ways of actually doing business, in this case in the end of life, is not an easy job, in fact. Getting a regulation change isn't, you don't do that like that. And getting legislation amended is, like Senator Carstairs says, it's a major undertaking to get it on the priority list and, get it thought through and get everyone agreed to make that their priority of the day. So we're trying to stay out ahead. We're trying to be very cognizant that there's not just one way to provide end of life. It has to be diverse. We have a huge geographic challenge in this province. We've got some big urban health authorities who have some kinds of challenges, and then we have, the north, who's serving people, they're serving a fraction of the population in more than half the geographic area of the province. So you can imagine what they're going to do is going to have to look pretty different from what we're doing in Surrey. So we're driving the authorities. We've got the benefits of the research that's being done. That's extremely helpful. We funded CIHI with the other western provinces to develop some indicators for us to track and help drive our system, because as we know, what are the important indicators that actually, as they get better, that's progress that you make. That's really important, and if we have them that we can compare with at least 4 other provinces that have some similar challenges, that helps us. So we've given CIHI funds to get that underway. We've talked to the BCMA, and you probably don't know, but in the last agreement that we bashed out with the BCMA, part of it was in our primary care renewal, we put $70 million on the table and said, okay, we want to use this to drive change in the primary care community to meet the needs of our public first and foremost, and to help our primary care physicians feel that the important work they do is a bit easier, it's not such a struggle and a fight, and that people recognize that a primary care physician taking proper care of somebody at end of life actually, it's not a losing wicket for them in terms of, their ability to stay afloat. And so providing care for people at end of life was one of the few areas that we said we want to focus on that. And now there's a committee that's about to make some decisions that's actually working together with the ministry and the health authorities to say, okay, let's use some of that $70 million to support doctors so that they can provide better care at end of life, and that's an expectation that they do that. So what you see is that when you get leaders at the federal level, like Senator Carstairs, and you start to get some momentum and you start to raise the consciousness, then you get the drive for what needs to happen. And then you have the stakeholder communities that are, of a whole variety and very diverse, and they start to pick up the refrain. But it's actually getting it implemented where the rubber hits the road. That's the tough part. And as you know, you can talk and talk and talk about things, and you can do research, and you can talk about best practice, and you can talk about goals, and talk about visions, and talk about mandates, but where the rubber hits the road, where you're with your family member who's dying at their end of life, and you're trying to make the system work for you, that's where the rubber's hitting the road. And that's where you need a strategic approach. You got to work your way through all the different barriers and one by one pick them off and bring in the supports and take away the barriers and get the team together. Let them take some risks. Let them be a little bit, try some new things, because what they have in terms of their supports, if you say, well, if you don't have X, Y, and Z, you can't get going. Well, if you stick with that, then you're going to have lots of communities in this province that are never going to get going. So what you have to say is, look, here are the basic elements. Here's the principles. Here are the indicators. Now, you come back with a plan of how you're going to make this work in your community. And then if we see there's barriers and regulations that it doesn't work, then that allows us to start to figure out how we get around some of those things. Or where actually this part of the plan, you know what, that is too risky. We shouldn't be doing that. But then you can look at all the basic platforms that are out there in our system already that can actually come in and support it, like the nurse line, like the patient safety task force that we have, because there are safety issues at end of life, and it's scary, as you know, looking after someone at end of life. And so we have to have some of those parameters, you know, thought about and cared for. So we've got a group that could actually do that. So you want to use your platforms that are there, identify the issues and bring it on. And then you need the government, as we are, to drive the system to actually move. Reflecting a framework that is best practice and makes sense, and tracking how they're doing with indicators, and feedback from the public. The final thing that I want to talk about is, you know, the whole issue of the, you know, the settings and how are we doing in terms of actually, you know, getting the amount of capacity that we need to get to our target of, you know, how many people should actually be able to die at home. And what's the variety of people? Because I think, as we've heard, they can be very, very young, all the way to our very senior members. And, you know, our seniors population are obviously the majority, but there are people all along the age continuum, you know, who die with neurological issues, cancer, heart problems, you know, all kinds of things, some of which you don't expect. And so you have to be able to move beyond the cancer issue and address all of those. And that takes even more broad expertise. So, you know, we need our drug benefit program to continue to be built, and we've moved that into our pharmacare area now so that it's able to move along with the rest of our public drug plan. And it's growing. Every year we have thousands more British Columbians who actually make use of that program. And that's one of our best indicators of actually who is dying at home, because, you know, they will make use of that program. And so we've had a 42% growth in that program just over the last 3 years. So that's a very significant increase. And, you know, our plan is like, just, we got to keep going. In terms of our actual facilities, part of end of life, particularly for people living with chronic disability and our seniors, what we know is a few things. Things have really changed even in 5 years. First of all, we know seniors want to remain independent. Just like my mother, she did not want to go, even at the end of life, into a hospital, and she didn't want to go into a complex care facility. And she never wanted to live her life at that point, and she was lucky. She didn't have to. But some people do have to take advantage of you know, increasing supports that might be available to them, and that's what we are trying to build. And it's been a difficult way, but I think in British Columbia we have, in 4 years, leaped ahead of many other parts of this country in terms of we have a continuum now. And we have the opportunity for people to be supported at home as they're getting frail, and in specially built housing that provides supports for them in assisted living. And our complex care, our residential care facilities, you know, are starting to actually be able to address people who really do have complex needs, whether they're actual care needs or whether they have things like severe dementia where they need a different kind of care that you know, isn't about lying in bed all day, but is actually about actually being safeguarded and protected while they have as best a quality of life. And that's a very important component of all this. Because if you just run end-of-life programs and you don't take care of people who are aging and allow them to remain as independent and with their families as long as you can, and then when they can't do that anymore to make sure that they are cared for, then you will have kind of lost the run-up to lots of end-of-life issues. So that's a big part of our work as well. And, you know, over the next few years, we will continue to build our residential care facility, our assisted living facility, our supportive housing activities. All of those are on the books of the health authorities, and we are continuing to drive that. And that will also make a difference, because those will provide environments where there are other choices. So if you think of an elderly couple, and many more of our seniors are couples now. The vision of it's just frail women living is disappearing. And if you look at the demographics, our men are living longer and longer. And so we have more couples in their 80s and becoming frail together than we ever have for over 15 years. And so we have to address that. And that's an advantage for end of life, because that means that, you know, we're not dealing with people living alone. We're going to be dealing even with people in couples, but they do need to be supportive. And we're going to have to think about what our palliative care and our end of life programs need to look like. So in summary, this government is very committed. I think that a little bit under the radar screen, our health authorities are moving ahead. They are engaging the hospice movement. They have very clear direction from the ministry. We will be publishing a framework as soon as we can get it out the door. It won't be a surprise to any of you. I think you know that we're very committed to the best practices that were outlined in our discussion paper. We still have more policy work to do. We still have amendments to our regulations to make it as easy as possible for our facilities to do this work. UBC has one of the best curriculum pieces now in terms of end-of-life care, so that's coming along in terms of our doctors. We're trying to build into our physician funding support for physicians to provide proper care at end of life, and we need to make sure that if they're already practicing, that they can get access to the proper skills that they will need to actually do a good job. We're bringing the nurse line in as a robust support for both families and for providers. I'd like to see the palliative care teams that we have on call in this province, and there's a number of them, actually getting together and talking about how they can support the whole province. Because I don't actually think it makes a lot of sense, nor is it a good use of funds to have, a small group of real experts only available to the people lucky enough to live in their geographic region. And I think that there are ways that we could have them be a sort of a second tranche resource for the whole province, and the providers who are starting to lay the groundwork in all the communities in our province. We have to figure out models that can cope with the fact that we have some very small, very isolated communities, and that's why things like telehealth that Senator Carster has talked about, and the web and virtual information and the nurse line, which is only a phone call away, can really support both those families and those providers. So we need to be nimble. We need to be very creative. We need, and we have the commitment of the ministry to try and keep up with that and not have policy barriers. There are huge demands on our resources, but this is a very important piece of seniors' care and care for other people, and we are spending more and more resources every year on this, and we will continue to drive that. And so that I think we will see British Columbia be one of the real success stories in a way that's very consistent across the province. But most importantly, where this aspect of care is integrated into our whole system, so that it's not sort of another silo that we've created, that it's integrated and everyone understands, as Gloria has pointed out, it is part of the continuum. Like, it's not some kind of out-of-world experience dying, it's actually part of life, and we're all heading there. And so our healthcare system has to see that as a seamless flow into whatever time of life it happens to an individual, that's just a seamless part of everybody's business. And so that's where we're going. And I'm not going to cite you a whole bunch of numbers and everything, but I feel very hopeful. I don't know how you feel. I'm interested to hear whether you know about everything that's going on, what the issues are that you see. I'd be very interested in hearing those. That's one of the opportunities when I come out and have an opportunity to talk to a group like this. I like to hear what you see as some of the barriers and problems, because I can take those back. And one of the few perks of being the deputy minister is, when the deputy says, this is important, sometimes everyone hops. Not always. I wish. So I'm very interested to hear, and that's what I was going to share with you today, Gloria, and I really appreciate the opportunity, and I think the dedication of people like you and the different societies and organizations that have fought this fight, from the early days of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and other leaders in the 60s and early 70s, when I first really started to understand what this was all about. It's been a long time. And given that we've all been dying all those years, it seems a bit bizarre, but I think we have a lot of momentum. And I think in this province, we're very committed. It's an integral part of our healthcare system. It's not a silo. We expect it. It's not going to happen overnight. We see that we're taking a very diverse response, but it's based on evidence and best practice, and I think we're trying to pick off all the different components of the system and make sure that they don't have an excuse for not being able to play their part in it, and that it slowly but surely gets as coherent as we can possibly make it, and so it is seamless and meets the needs of our public.